I'm Pennsylvanian by birth. I lived 10 years of my boyhood in a tiny town in south central Michigan, and we were hit by the Depression, and everybody was cut down. My father was cut down by economic forces I was too young to understand, but not too young to be afraid of. And I became very much aware of the plight of the poor and the plight of ordinary working people who were thrown out of work. And I think that was one of the early critical experiences of my life. And it heightened and created a sensitivity, the struggle to survive, and a sense of responsibility for one another, that we were all involved in each other's lives. The dramatic moment for me, I mean, there were two moments. One was the experience of the Depression and the recognition of common responsibility for one another as human beings, and also the injustice in the economic order that can bring a whole society down, and ordinary human beings be crushed by that, forces beyond their control. And then there was the experience of anti-Semitism, which had to do with a drive to explore the deeper dimensions of my own religious tradition, its philosophy, its history, and literature. There, I became aware that this was a tradition that had a profound concern for justice and for peace. For me, to be a good Jew was to be concerned with the welfare of all human beings, whoever they were. And the initial issues that we had to deal with were, of course, the issues of racial justice, the injustice that had been perpetrated against the black people. And then further, I became caught up in the quest for peace, because the pursuit of peace is something that lay at the very center of the Jewish aspiration. And I saw that that was the common aspiration, initially of Jews and Christians, but ultimately we would come to see our unity with people of all faiths, Muslims, and others. When I became a rabbi, that became the very center of my work. And from the very beginning, I became involved in interfaith work. It was the war in the Persian Gulf that brought us together with the Muslim community. My first meeting with Dr. Maher Atut took place in a bookstore in Santa Monica, the Midnight Special Bookstore, at a discussion of the Israeli-Palestinian issue, where Dr. Atut and I discovered that we were brothers. And out of our separate religious tradition, we were at one with one another in what I've said before, which I think lies at the heart of Christianity, Judaism and Christianity, and Islam, and that is the sacredness of human life, something divine, and something that brings with it a dimension of obligation that has no ending, an insistence that human beings are really here to love one another, to care for one another, and to live peacefully and fulfill themselves as human beings, as children of God in that way. When the three religious faiths together, held public religious services every week in opposition to an impending war, and then through the years, the early months of the war itself. And that was a friendship that developed then and continued and deepened over the years. So for us, it's something utterly natural and nothing unusual about this sense of common purpose and common dedication and the unity of our faiths and respect for one another and the recognition of the ideals we hold in common. in spite of whatever differences may divide us theologically or even on certain political issues, whatever they may be, there is still that fundamental unifying premise. From the beginning, it was something that we were alone in doing. I mean, then we found many to come with us, to join us, lay people as well as clergy. So it was no longer unique at the moment that others saw the justice and the truth of what we were trying to do. I think that purpose is still alive today, and I think is in some ways more threatened today, because the passion that the American people had, let's say, in opposing the war in Vietnam, or even as expressed in the opposition to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the invasion of the Persian Gulf, I mean, that surely has diminished. And the issue has somehow become more complex. And so, which makes the interfaith endeavor all the more important, in my view, because the causes that have engaged us were never popular from the beginning, and nor were they ever popular even when first imagined, let's say in my tradition or Christian tradition, the teachings of the Bible. I mean, those who enunciated the ideals of people living in peace and the responsibility to the stranger, and the immigrant, and so forth. Those were always the ideals of a minority. They never became the way of life of any society. So it's the sense of the not yet, the sense of living in the world that is not yet what it is meant to be, that has driven the imagination of people of religion who see that aspect of their religious faith as being central to their purpose as human beings. I think there is still a necessary place for that, particularly at a time when there is such a passion for security above all things. After all, that is what drives the Israelis. I mean, a concern for security. That's what drives Americans to be seemingly indifferent to the invasion of our privacy, the capacity of our government to ignore our civil liberties, all in the name of security. In the name of security, the worst injustices can be perpetrated. And that's a more kind of sophisticated issue to deal with. I've always believed that religion has to be political. Has to be political because politics has to do with the decisions that we make about how we live and how we die, and who shall live and who shall die and who shall experience justice and equity in the workplace and so forth. I mean, that's where those decisions are made, and that's where religion has to be. And that doesn't mean necessarily partisan politics or voting for particular individuals, but it does mean that we're concerned about the profound ethical issues that lie at the heart of so many of the decisions that will determine how we're going to live as a society. And religion has to be there. Religion, that is indifferent to those concerns, I think is not really being true to itself. I mean, not that we're not concerned about what's happening to the individual human being and the need for a spiritual experience, a concern for the sick and the wounded, I mean, of spirit and like, and not we're concerned about those issues as well. But justice and peace, without them, there can be no real human, certainly no humane kind of living. And that, I think, is the responsibility of people of faith. I think we have, sometimes through unfeeling, through indifference. Not that we're capable of perpetrating violence necessarily ourselves, but we can be quite indifferent, numb to the ethical issues in many of the things that we're willing to do. I mean, sort of a classic example of that is the use of drones today. Also, there are values in our own society about individual liberty, the rights of the individual to achieve whatever he or she wishes, as being central to the meaning of democracy. And this has a tendency to ignore the need for our dependency on one another, that no one exists in splendid isolation, that all of us are in one way or another dependent upon one another. And I think that this celebration of the individual can sometimes be purchased at the price of indifference to our necessary connection with everyone in order to make our individual life possible. So that focus and celebration of individualism is something that has certainly worked against the sense of our mutual accountability for one another. So I think that the various religions have a responsibility, to keep this reality awake in the imagination. And connected with that obviously means a connection not only with people in your own neighborhood or your own city or your own society, but with all human beings. I mean, we all want to live a little life and die a little death close to someone who loves us in decency and in peace. Every person wants that, wherever they may be. The purpose of a rabbi is to be a failure, to try to become a brilliant failure. Because the values that a rabbi affirms are constantly being subject to defeat in society. And yet our purpose is to keep them alive and freshly remembered. So we will always fail, never completely fulfill our ultimate quest, and yet that is what our purpose is to be. At least thus far in human history, living in peace and justice is an unfulfilled aspiration. And yet we feel called to it. People who belong to the ICUJP, Christians, Jews, Muslims, we feel called to it.